Welcome to Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. Join Toby Malone and TJ Young, along with some special friends, as we puzzle our way through what we once thought was an unreadable book to produce a surprisingly listenable podcast. It is Wednesday, June 19th, 2024. It has been 34 days since we have started reading, with 103 pages complete of 628, meaning we have 525 pages left to go and are 16.4% of the way through Finnegans Wake. Welcome to episode 9 of Wake, the podcast which is picking up momentum, uncovering meaning and putting some respect on the name of HCE, all in the name of fulfilling a long-held bucket list item, reading James Joyce's Finnegans Wake out loud just once. I am your host, Toby Malone, joined as always by the most stylish man in podcasting, the undeniable TJ Young, sweltering under the heat dome. How are you, TJ?
You know, I love the way that you say I'm stylish when no one can see me, so I appreciate that.
You just got to take my word for it, folks.
As I wear my Spider-Man shirt with my silver chain, it makes no sense. The fashion sense never left the fourth grade, but here we are. I'm doing all right. I am very hot all the time until the sun goes down, and then I'm cool and freezing in my house because I never turn off the window units. But I am doing okay, you know. And more importantly, my basil's doing okay because the basil's enjoying the heat and it's flourishing. So,
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to have you here. And joining us this week, as promised, we are joined by a very special guest who I'm going to upset immediately when I refer to him as our first purist guest. But honestly, once you hear him speak on the topic, you'll understand I'm using that as a term of endearment and respect. Neil Wechsler is a dear friend of mine who also happens to be one of my favorite playwrights. So I'm feeling very fortunate today with my two favorite playwrights in the room with me right now. Neil's play Grenadine won the 2008 Yale Drama Prize, which is incredibly prestigious. And this is a play that got the stamp of approval from none other than playwright Edward Albee. So Grenadine is a seriously brilliant play, and along with Neil's other incredible works, all of which I'll link to on our Patreon, we are in the presence of greatness, folks. So welcome, Neil.
I don't know if you can hear my applause.
Well, that was too kind, and I mean, I'm just happy to be with two of my favorite people today, and I think I'm going to leave it at that. We will talk about that purist word, I'm sure, at some point, but maybe I should wait for a question to prompt that. But yeah, happy to be here.
Very glad to have you here. I think you're going to have a lot to say and going to bring a lot of really interesting texture to today's podcast. And in fact, we're actually going to be dividing today's reading into two episodes. Like we always do that. We divide most chapters into two. But today, Neil will be joining us for both halves. So you'll be hearing him today and also next week. And Neil has so much to say on the topic that I don't want to rush the reading. So we'll talk Joyce at the top here. We'll start our reading. Then the podcast will abruptly end in the middle. And then we'll pick it up next week. And then we'll be talking about a response the following episode. So at the end, we're talking about it all together. So Neil, I'm so glad you're here. You have a fairly strong relationship with Joyce in the way.
Oh, I mean, I love this book. It's definitely one of my favorite books. So that's when I heard that you were doing this, it was this kind of interesting thing. I hadn't really thought about the book in a while, so it sort of brought back a lot of memories.
When did you first encounter it?
I read it for the first time when I was living in New York City. So that was shortly after college. We're talking 25 years ago. That's the first time I read it. But
and
it was college, yeah.
What brought you to it, though? Was it a recommendation or you just picked it up?
Oh, I was sort of right after. So I read in college. I was I didn't read a lot of. I was a double major in philosophy and psychology. So the literature I did read was a lot of like philosophy of. Existential literature or whatever kind of that, whatever that meant really in terms of those types of works. But then right after college, as I started doing some more writing, I just started working my way through various things. And I read Ulysses first, which I loved. And I'd read Portrait of the Artist and Dubliners at some those I read earlier on in late high school or college, but read Ulysses shortly before I read Finnegans Wake. And then, the moment I started reading Finnegans Wake, I loved it. I love Ulysses. And then, just love The Wake.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that this has influenced your work as a playwright?
Oh, yeah, definitely did. I would say like more, because at that time I was also reading more, that led to reading lots of Beckett. And I would say that I'm if you had to like break down my own writing, you guys probably know this, I'm more influenced by Beckett, but clearly Joyce had a major impact on Beckett, right? So like it's in fact that relationship's really interesting, I think, because Beckett worked with Joyce on Finnegans Wake, right? He was helping him because Joyce was losing his eyesight, so there was almost like an assistant like capacity. Definitely like a father figure, mentor figure for Beckett. Beckett adored Joyce, and actually in his own work had that epiphany that the more Joyce knew, the more he could do, right? Which is very, very clear when you read Finnegans Wake. It's this how do you compete with that? Joyce would have said to anyone else, how do you compete with this, right? He would have been the first to probably say, no one can compete with this. And Beckett had tried initially, his early work, you see a lot of the influence, like he's trying to do some of these leaps, right? And then he sort of had that epiphany of like, I can't do that. I have to go spare. And we see that transition in Beckett's own work where he did things like started to write in French and translating back to English in order to be able to, to sort of find his own voice within that. And then, so how this connects to me is like, I think I'm more influenced by that spare move, right? The sort of spare approach, but still it's still rooted in that trajectory of trying to figure out what words mean, how they mean certain things, and how we can cope with the kind of various collapses of language that take place over time, especially when we think in terms of trying to map words onto meaning, right? And words onto thoughts and words onto the world as we're going through all these things. Yeah, now I'm babbling too much. You guys should
no apologizing.
You should hold up like a red flag at some point as a note. Like, you've said too much. It's starting to become boring. But anyway, that's the initial. That's sort of the broad view of that idea of like where I think my actual influence lies.
I love what you said about the more you know, the more you can do, because we often talk about like if a first time novelist had tried to come out with something like Finnegans Wake, everyone would be like, "What the hell? Get this away from me!" Right? But it is about being in your craft long enough to know how far you can reach, right? And I think the three of us often interact with writers who have grand ideas but don't necessarily have the skill base to execute those ideas yet. So Breck being like, I want to do something like Finnegans Wake. Wait, I don't have the skill base yet to be able to reach that. I think that's just extremely interesting. And it's also just a note to, I think, a lot of, if there's any writers or artists out there listening, yes, you can look at the thing that's fantastic and be like, I want to be able to do that, but also know that you have to establish the skill base and the ability to do that. And it's funny because I always say the reason I'm always disappointed in anything that I do is because my taste level is up there, but the skill base hasn't reached the taste level yet, right?
Yeah, and the last thing a 20-year-old playwright wants to hear is, give it 40 years. And work for 40 years and be patient. Keep working. And then you can make something great.
Yeah. Everyone's trying to peak at 19, and I'm like, but why?
And Beckett, like that Beckett relationship with Joyce is so meaningful there because Beckett had unbelievable confidence in himself, but also had a ton of humility. And part of that humility, I think, really came from how good Joyce was, right? I mean, Beckett would say things like, I couldn't be an English teacher because it's just simply too hard, right? And like, this is like, I mean, Beckett is an unbelievably brilliant writer, right? And you can see him struggling in some of his really early work to find that voice. And that, I think, to TJ's point, it's like part of the issue with a younger writer is like, you do have to find your own voice. You should shoot, obviously, for the stars, right? But like, it's that combination, which we, all of us have done teaching at various levels. And it's like, you're trying to teach someone that you don't know quite as much as you think you know, but you're capable of knowing far more than you think you're capable of, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's like such a gap between those two things, and it's very hard to exist in that space, right? You want to either think you know something, or that you want to think it's more quantifiable. So I think, and that's a real, especially as writing has changed over time, right? And part of what Joyce is doing with this work is like, we see this in lots of but the early 20th century, it's like, what was he going to do? Is he going to continue to write the same things over and over again? I mean, he was trying to, if we look at like what's happening in like quantum mechanics at the time or something, right? A lot of the things that are transforming, or Freudian psychology, which is clearly an influence on Finnegans Wake, right? This idea of layers of consciousness, layers of like how do we, to me, that's the entry point into Finnegans Wake, is like, I think where a lot of people stumble with it is we have this preconception that you can somehow have a one-to-one correspondence with thought and meaning, right? Or with like, oh, these are my thoughts, these are the words to capture those thoughts, that's the world out there, these are my words to capture the world out there. And the reality is you can't draw these one-to-one correspondences, right? Words do not exist at that level. And Joyce's, I am convinced, this is my like big point about Finnegans Wake, I guess, I am convinced that he is holding the mirror up to nature with this work, right? And that like this is not an attempt. I know people think, oh, he's trying to be super clever, he's trying to like just be this overly intellectualized person or whatever. He's trying to say like no one, and then is there an element of him that's trying to be like, look, this work could be deconstructed till the end of time, and there's so much meaning in here. I don't think that's it, nor do I think it's just like, oh, look, this sounds pretty, right? This is just beautiful. It sounds beautiful. Both of those approaches to the work, I think, are fine if you want to read it just for the sound of the words, if you want to read it because you want to deconstruct it. But I think the beauty of it is when those two things line up. And he was all about epiphanies, and it was all about when the sound and the sense come together in harmony in this work. It's extraordinary. And it maps onto, I think, our experience of human life, which is, sometimes you roll through it and not much is sort of making sense. And then all of a sudden everything crystallizes. And the book teaches us how to read it. And I said this to Toby when we were talking initially, like the final 10 pages of this book are the best 10 pages that I've ever encountered in anything ever, anywhere. And it's because that the meaning and the words and the thoughts and the ways in which he's trying to capture this incredibly challenging thing called human life is captured through his lens, because we can only capture things through our own lens ultimately, is just extraordinary. And he does it through this painstaking time that he spent on this book, not to mention his life prior to that, which led to him getting to here, right? So this is like the culmination of that attempt to make sense of the world.
I would just want to give a time step that 11 minutes into episode 9 is when the podcast became legitimate. So, because that was beautiful.
Bringing professionals on board really pays off. This is
but it's funny. Yeah. I'm not a professional like on this, right? It's like, it's funny. I mean, I have like, you use that word purist. Like I would think most Joyce purists would probably be like, who is this guy? Right? Like, because I don't even, that's a strange word. There's almost like a connotation on like a purist, right? There's something a little pompous about a purist ultimately, sure. Right? Like there's something overly intellectualized maybe. And like, I've always said, like, you should like what you should want to like. I have friends who say this thing is like, this book it's unreadable. I like Nabokov a lot, for instance. Nabokov couldn't stand this work. He's like, it's just, and like, these are all perspectives on it that are warranted, I think. And I think the overly intellectual attempt on Finnegans Wake is actually problematic because it makes you think like you have to somehow, again, find all these one-to-one correspondences, or you're constantly asking about meaning. And there are certainly times you want to ask about the meaning, but really it's like, what is again, I think if we think in terms of that mirror up to nature thing, it's helpful as a guide on this. Like, how does your own life, in terms of trying to capture your own consciousness, like we hear him talk about the we hear that phrase sometimes. Well, Ulysses was a day in the life, and Finnegans Wake is a night in the life, right? And I think there's some kind of truth to that. And I mean, Joyce would probably, there's sort of some parameter there that makes sense. But it's really just a starting point, right? I think if anything, it's because the night life is maybe a bigger onion that you have to unpeel the various layers to, which makes it maybe more of a map onto human life when we really break down all the layers of our own thought, right? And so in some sense it goes beyond Ulysses, if that's, which is quite an amazing achievement, even though it sort of, as we see in terms of readers' responses, it maybe goes too far. Although I think you said this, I think I was listening to the last recorded podcast, and you said that thing about Joyce had that line that if you were to give this one book to someone, you could unpack all of human civilization in it, right?
Right.
And I think that's like, I think it's true. I mean, if I had to give an alien coming down like one thing to provide a window onto human life, this would be it, because I think you can keep going further and further into it. I think it does, again, map the human experience in my mind brilliantly. But there are elements where I could certainly understand when someone says, well, that's unreadable, right? Those two things to me are not contradictory, nor is it like an intellectual difference. I think we can all understand how certain elements of life are unfathomable or something, right? And I think that he's always making a choice with a word that's intentional, and he always is aware of possibilities there. Is it possible that like there are some meanings that he's not aware of course, because someone's going to read this 50 years later and there's going to be some different turn on that word, but he's fully aware of setting that up for the possibilities there. It's never like, well, I'm going to spell the word this way because I just don't give a shit anymore, right? It's like that's never it. I think he cared very deeply about this, and he cared very deeply about the attempt to make sense of the world. I think that was always his mission, and I don't think that gets interrupted at all in his attempt here.
And I very much feel as though your work is attempting to do similar kinds of things, is that your work is complex and it's deep. It's got that Beckett-like simplicity, but the multitudes that lines contain. And so you've got plays like Grenadine and The Brown Bull of Killinay and Espadadden, these plays, which none of them are simple plays. And there's so much in there that there's philosophy and there's history and there's humor and there's so much in there. And I feel as though what you're always trying to do is explore your way through meaning. And you never sell out. I've always admired, you've always expressed, I've known you for 15 years now, and you've always expressed a frustration about trying to get these complex works out into the world, and the fact that because they are difficult and because they are complex, they scare people off because people go, I don't know how I could sell this. But Grenadine's the play that I recommend more than any other play, and I've taught it and I've been involved in productions of it, and it's putting that stuff out into the world to say, no, there's meaning here. You were talking the other day about meaning, and that word continuing to come up about how the depths of how a word can just go down and down and down, which I guess is why you had objected to that phrase that I had said, that this is an unreadable book, an unlistenable podcast, which, a catchphrase which we've now abandoned because we found meaning ourselves. We started listening and going, there is something here. This isn't just babbling. This isn't just grunts and noises. This is meaning. I mean, a long way around to just say that I can really see the Joyce in your work.
Yeah, and I think that people have definitely told me at various times, why don't you write something that's easily marketed, and then you can put out your other works, right? Now, just as a point, like, yes, those works that you mentioned that I've written, they are difficult, and I did write one thing that's probably almost as difficult as Finnegans Wake, Orphans of Elsinore, but that's another story. But it's Grenadine, Brown Bull. They're not like Finnegans Wake, right? I mean, they at the same time, life changes. I mean, the world changes in terms of what it considers to be. And people have said to me, well, if you had written these works earlier, like maybe in the 60s or at a time when like that sort of maybe more experimental work, I don't even think it's that experimental, but the point is it clearly doesn't fit maybe as easily into a box as what sometimes people are looking for. But at some point I was like, well, what are you going to do? Like Joyce, of course, had the trajectory of like, he could always fall back on, well, look at the success of Dubliners, Ulysses, Portrait of the Artist, right? Whereas with me, Edward Albee would go into places and just tell directors that they were idiots for not producing my work. And that doesn't really work. Edward would say, well, you just tell every director that thinks they have a problem with your work to go screw themselves. I also said that also tends not to work, Edward. But so I think that I do relate to that, but I relate to it in the way of like, yeah, but I didn't even get to the point where I could say, well, by the way, like you can look back on these things. So I don't know. And at some point I kind of gave up because I couldn't do that. I didn't know what that meant to produce to write something that could somehow be a precursor to Grenadine or whatever. Right. I couldn't like figure it out in my brain. Like at that point I was beyond it. And then, as you know, I kind of almost gave up on trying to do something that just wasn't anyway. But this should not be about me. Now I hope.
Well, no, it is about you, and the key point here is you almost gave up. You haven't given up fully yet, and your plays are out there in the world and should be read and produced. And yeah, both TJ and I are giant Neil Wechsler fans.
Yeah, every once in a while I see a student director in particular who they're reaching for something and I just slide them Grenadine. And I'm like, this is what you're reaching for. Knowing that 5 years from now, they're going to be like, hey, there's that play. Mm-hmm. I just like to plant seeds along the way and be like, yeah, I'm not saying you should, but I think you should.
Well, you know how much I appreciate that, because that 5-year mark that you mentioned, I was told that 20 years ago, and then it sort of at some point you're like, oh, when is that? But you do have hope, right? Because it's not like people don't react to it still. I was teaching it recently because someone asked me to do a workshop on it. So it doesn't die, you're right. But it's just like my attempt to try to figure out how to work it within the system is died. That's like, I can't keep submitting it to places that are just going to tell me you should write, so it's like those types of attempts are what's, but yeah, again, this is a different type of tangent, but obviously I appreciate what you guys are saying. In my mind, it gives me a lot of hope because I know that there are still people who connect with it, right?
And exactly like Finnegans Wake, these works remain eternal. And as long as someone's reading them and interpreting them, then they're alive. And so we find, I think, just to wrap up this preamble section, I think that what you're showing us is that this is a book that really rewards reread. And you said that you've read it a couple of times.
Yeah.
So what was your second reading like?
I think, yeah, after I finish it the first time, again, when it starts to make more and more sense as you go. Like, again, I got it. I got what he was doing, right? That whole mirror, so I think because I sort of grasped what he was trying to do early on, or at least I thought from my reading of it, I was kind of getting that entry point into it. I loved the whole reading of it, but definitely by the end of it, there's a greater clarity there. I would say the next phase of it was reading bits of it, a lot, right? Like going back to my favorite passages and just reading them over and over and so on. The full second reading probably didn't happen till about 10 years later, once, there'd been a little bit of time with it. I've definitely read it cover to cover twice, and then multiple times where I would just sort of go back and read my favorite passages.
What is your number one favorite passage? Like, is there a segment that
definitely the final, as I said, the final 10 pages are just extraordinary. Apart from that, it's just a page here and there which really resonated and just had so many layers, and it worked on so many levels that it just felt so. Again, that epiphany word is thrown around a lot with Joyce, but I do think that's what drove him. I mean, for him, that was how this mapping, the attempt to map, to make sense of this very difficult thing to make sense of, right? Human life, like it's extraordinarily hard. And I think for him, this idea of the epiphany was what made most sense, and that resonates with me too, right? When everything kind of comes together and you have these moments where there's some clarity, right? But the clarity itself doesn't mean that it's like just the clarity itself can often be quite confusing, right? I think that's part of the challenge, is that clarity, it doesn't necessarily mean easy, right? Clarity can be, but it's clean. There's a cleanness to clarity, but what that means, and now I'm starting to babble, but like that but because I'm not coming up with an epiphany, I'm trying to talk about an epiphany in a way that's very uninspiring, which also doesn't work. But that's where Joyce comes in, and maybe that's a good transition to actually reading it, because we can get away from
absolutely. And so the chapter we're reading today is chapter 1-5, which is a long, short chapter. So it comes in around 22 pages. So we usually read around 12 or 15 pages at a time. So we're going to read the whole thing and then split this up. And so here we're going to get our first introduction to Anna Livia Pluribel, HCE's wife, and the symbol for both the river Liffey and the feminine in general. And there's another long list that starts out at the beginning of this chapter, so much so that I considered asking one of my kids to read this one too. I thought about it, and then I decided to leave it be. And we also have a thunder word coming toward the end of the chapter, and some interesting typesets. So some good stuff happening. We're reading, as always, from the Penguin Modern Classics edition of Finnegans Wake, published in 2000 with a forward by Seamus Dean. Today we'll be reading the first half of chapter 1-5 in this episode, and the second half in the next episode. So the first episode today we'll be reading pages 103 to 112, and then 112 to 125 in the next episode. This is a segment that's entitled The Mama Festa, a new focus for the investigation, the letter, by the Oxford World's Classic edition of 2012, which also includes brief summaries of what's happening in each subsection, which we will address at the end of the reading. As I said, we'll be taking turns reading. Sometimes we'll be changing readers at the end of a segment, sometimes in the middle. Neil, as always, if you want to tap out of reading, just give us the timeout sign and we will step in to take over. There's no shame in tapping out if you expressed before we started that you were feeling a little nervous about the out loud reading part of it, but I'm sure you're going to do fine. And now, without further ado, Finnegans Wake. In the name of Anna, the all-mazerful, the ever-living, the bringer of plurabilities, haloed be her eve, her sing-time sung, her rill be run, unhemmed as it is and uneven. Her untitled Mama Festa, memorializing the most highest, has gone by many names at disjointed times. Thus we hear of the Augusta Augustivmost for Old Sebistius salvation, Rockabill Booby in the wave trough. Here's to the relics of all decencies, Anastasia's rise to notice, nickel down Duddy gun and Arish Sir Cannon, my golden one and my Selva wedding, Amory Tristum and icy cistule, saith the Sawyer till a strame. Ick dick dope dope et tu mihi mihi, buy birthplate for a bite. Which of your Hesterdays mean ye tomorrow? Hobigun the Hebrewer hit Waterman the brained. Arcs in his ceiling flee chinks on the fleur. Rebus de Hibernicis, the crazier letters, groans of a Britoness. Peter Peopler picked a plot to pitch his popolin. An apology for a big, some such know noun as husband, or husboat, or hosebound. It's probably understood, for we have also the Pluther plethoric. My hoons bood hands bad our journey to Pothergill gone, and he never has the hour. Ought we to visit him? For Arksea Zoo, Cleopatra's needlework, picturing Albrauham on the Sahara with the combing of the camels and the parlour maids of Egypt. Cock in the pot for father. Place at Vestre. A new cure for an old clap. Where portentos there'd grow Gonda, how I wish I'd woos a geese. Gettle netty. Thrust him not. When the myrtles of Venice played to Blockus line. To plunge me high, he waves, chiltern on friends. Ormond's Q visits Amen Mart. E'en though I granny a be, he would fain me cuddle. 20 of chambers, weighty 10 beds, and a wan set-room. I led the life. Through the boxer cocks arising in the house with the golden stairs. The following fork. He's my O Jerusalem, and I'm his Poe, the best in the West, by the stream of Zemzem under zigzag till. The man that made his mother in the Marlbury train. Try our tile on a torb. The log of Annie to the base all. Nopper tipped a nappy wank to his not little dancy girls. Purs orzer oral, the king of ordlebs. Intimer minislisp of an exterior monoloth. Drink to him, my jucky, and dolt bemind thy winnoring's sheet. I ask you to believe I was his mistress. He can explain. From Victrolia nuancy to Albart Noansy. Dar's a daisy, so gimme your Hansel too. What Barabbas done to a barrel organ before the rank tank and bond tail, husked vi admortal. What Jumbo made to Jallis and what Anisette to him. Ophelia's cool prince. Here hubty hublin, my old Danch. I am older North rogues among a wished I slips, and he calls me his jewel of Aisha. Suppotes a ventriloquist marries a corpse. Laps for Finns this funny coon's week. How the buckling shut at Rush in January. Look to the lady. From the rise of the Dudge public to the fall of the pot still. Of the two ways of opening the mouth. I have not stopped water where it should flow, and I know the 29 names of Recreanty. The Tortor of Tory Island traits Galacia like his milch cow. From Abbey Gate to Crow Alley through a lift in the Lude. Smocks for their graces and me aunt for them clodshoppers. How to pull a good Horace coup even when old sire is dead to the world. In the gleam of Waterloo, fath he's succeeded to my aspirations. 3 steps forward, 2 stops back. My skin appeals to 3 senses and my curly lips demand column kisses. Gage Street on a cranny's cabin savings. Them lads made a tryon of battle watchers, and they totties a doet of deers. In my lord's bed by one whore went through it. Mum, it is all over. Cowboy ride by 12-acre terrorists in the unique estates of Emessian. He gave me a thou, so I serve him with the thee. Of all the wide torsos in all the wide glen, O Dunna, white Dunna, he's Hugh to me cry, I'm the stitch in his backside, you'd not be naught without mom, to keep the huskies off the hustings and pitcher pecks from lifting shops, Norska Torska find the poddle, he pursed me here with the ardour of a Tonneberks, a boob was weeping, this mower was reaping, O Lachlan, up from the pit of my stomach I swish you the white of the morning, Anglo-Andean medleys from Tomini Moor. The great Polynesial entertainer exhibits Ballantine brooches with a link of natures. The mimic of Meg Neg and the Mackayes entered as the lastest pigatarial and my puriduricurial at Stitchener's Hall. Sigfield Follies and or a gentle Hom's Faut Pa. See the first book of J. Ulysses Pessim. The suspended sentence. A pretty brick story for child-size heroes. As low our sleep, I knew I'd got it in me, so fit settles that. Thunderbolt Captain Smith and a La Belle Sauvage Pocahontas. Way for wet weak Wellikins Dushka Marion. The last of the Fingalians. It was me egged him on to the Stork Exchange and lend my dutiful face to his customs. Chi-chi cheels on their China Michin. Picked me up, Peters. Lumpty-tum-tumpty had a big fall. Pim, pimp, pim, pimp. Measly ventures of 2 lice and the fall of fruit. The folks' family interior. If my spread eagles wasn't so tight, I'd loosen my cursets on that bunch of Maggie straps. All Osha popofets, and how cotch me eye. Seen Aples and thin dyed. I beg you to believes from love and mother. Finds fault was no felon. Exact Delvin renter life, the flash that flies from Vuggy's eyes, had set me hair on fire. His is the house that Malt made. Divine views from back to the front. Abe to Sayre stood ikic neuter till Brahm talked him common sex. A nibble at eve will that bowl relieve. All for guineas. Sounds and compliments libidinous. 7 wives awake week. Airy Ann and Berber Blut. Amy licks porter while Huffy chops eads. A brace of umbrellas or a triple of canes. Butter bust. From the Manor Hove to the Misses O'Mollys and from the dames to their sames. Many festoon for the colleagues on the green. An outstanding back and an excellent half-centre if called on. As tree is quick and stone is white, so is my washing done by night. First and last only true account all about the honorary Mersu earwicker LSD and the snake Nuggets by a woman of the world who only can tell naked truth about a dear man and all his conspirators, how they all tried to fall him, putting it all around Luke Lizod about Private's earwicker and a pair of sloppy sluts, plainly showing all the unmentioned nobility falsely accusing about the raincoats.
The proteiform graph itself is a polyhedron of scripture. There was a time when naive alphabeters would have written it down, the tracing of a purely deliquescent recidivist, possibly ambidextrous, snub-nosed probably, and presenting a strangely profound rainbow in his or her occiput. To the heartily curiosing entomophilist, then it has shown a very sex mosaic of nymphosis, in which the internal chimera hunter Oreolopus, now frond of sugars, then leaf of salts, the sensory crowd in his belly, coupled with an eye for the goods truth bewilder bliss by their night effluvia, with guns like drums and fondlers like forceps, persequestulates his Vanessas from floor to floor. Somehow this sounds like the purest Kittleyoon, wherein our mater Necrucian sounds, same line, of lower lore is rich. Also Haru from us him in a kitcher not darkness, by hazard and worn rolls arreared, we must grope on till 0 hour, like Poel Giors, as we are would we salve aught of moments for our eyesore today. Amosin though not but, closer inspection of the borderoo would reveal a multiplicity of personalities inflicted on the documents or document, and some provision of virtual crime or crimes might be made by anyone unwary enough before any suitable occasion for it or them had so far managed to happen along. In fact, under the closed eyes of the inspectors, the traits featuring the chiaroscuro coalesce, their contrarieties eliminated in one stable somebody, similarly as by the providential warring of heartshaker with housebreaker and of dram drinker against freethinker, our social something bowls along bumpily, experiencing a jolting series of prearranged disappointments down the long lane of it's as semper as oxhouse humper, generations, more generations, and still more generations. Say, Baroon Lucidor, who in the hall Hagal wrote the derned thing anyhow? Erect, beseated, mounteback against a party wall, below friezagrade, by the use of quill or style with turbid or pellucid mind, accompanied, or the reverse, by mastication, interrupted by visit of seer to scribe or of scribe to sight, atwixt 2 showers, or a toss of a trike, rained upon or blown around by a right-down regular racer from the soil, or by a 2-paned whittle wit laden with the loot of learning? Now patience. And remember, patience is the great thing, and above all things else we must avoid anything like being or becoming out of patience. A good plan used by worried business folk who may not have had many momentums to mask Kung's doctrine of the meaning or the propriety construces of carper mustimus is just to think of all the sinking fund of patience possessed in their conjoint names by both brothers Bruce, with whom are incorporated their Scotch Spider and Elberfed's calculating horses. If after years upon years of delving in ditches, dark one tub thumper, more than others, Kinnahoon or Canahan, Jardner or mere Meesin Manonger has got up for the darnel seen purpose of reassuring us with all the barber of the carriage house that our great descendant was properly speaking 3 syllables less than his own surname. Yes, less. That the ear of Fione or Wicker aforetime was the trademark of a broadcaster, with Wicker local jargon for an ace's patent. Here, calls everywhere. Then, as to this radio-silating epipistle to which cotton silk or samite, cahol, gall, or brick dust we must ceaselessly return, whereabouts exactly at present in Siam, Hell, or Tophet, under that glory saw which plays tourloop with us in the Saludin's cove of our sagacity, is that bright so and such to slip us the dinkum oil. Naysayers, we know, to conclude purely negatively from the positive absence of political odia and monetary requests that its page cannot ever have been a pen product of a man or woman of that period or those parts is only one more unlooked-for conclusion leaped at, being tantamount to inferring from the non-presence of inverted commas, sometimes called quotation marks, on any page that its author was always constitutionally incapable of misappropriating the spoken words of others.
Luckily, there is another cant to this questy. Has any fellow of the dime a dozen type? It might with some profit some dull evening quietly be hinted. Has any usually sort of ornery josser, flat-chested 40ish, faintly flatulent, and the given to ration rationation by syncopation and the elucidation of the complications of his greatest Feng Wang dyna, dynast, dynacades, dyna, dyna, cheese, dynasty. Dynasty cadescence, only the son of another, in fact, ever looking sufficiently longingly at a quiet, everyday looking, stamped, addressed envelope. Admittedly, it is an outer husk. Its face, and all its featureful perfection of imperfection, is its fortune. It exhibits only the civil or military clothing of whatever passion pallid nudity or plague purple nakedness may happen to tuck itself under its flap. Yet to concentrate solely on the literal sense of even the psychological content of any document, or the sore neglect of the enveloping facts themselves circumstantiating, it is just as hurtful to sound sense, and let it be added, to the truest taste, as were some fellow in the act of perhaps getting an intro from another fellow turning out to be a friend in need of his, say, to a lady of the latter's acquaintances engaged in performing the elaborative ancestral ceremony of obstetrance. Straightway to run off and vision her plump and plain as her natural altogether, prefering to close his blink-hard eyes to the ethiquetical fact that she was, after all, wearing for the space of the time being some definite articles of evolutionary clothing in harmonious creations. A captious critic might describe them as, or not strictly necessarily, or a trifling irritating here and there, but for all that suddenly full of local color and personal perfume, and suggestive, too, of some very much more incapable of being stretched, filled out, if need or wish were, of having the surprisingly like coincidental parts separated, don't they now, for better survey by the depth hand of an expert, don't you know? Who in his heart doubts either the facts of feminine clothing wearing are there all the time, and that the feminine fiction, stranger than the facts, is there also at the same time, only a little to the reverie? Or that one may be separated from the other? Or that both may be complicated simultaneously? Or that even may be taken up and considered in turn apart from the other?
Here let a few artifacts fend in their own favour. The river felt she wanted salt. That was just where Brian came in. The country asked for bear's paw for din-din, and bounden it got it surly. We who live under heaven, we of the clovery kingdom, we Middlesins people have often watched the sky overreaching the land. We suddenly have. Our isle is Sange, the place. That stern chuckler, mayhappy, mayhap not, once said to Repetition in that Lutheran conservatory way of his, that is it a chapel, as it a Lucan, was the one place, ult alt nult, in this mad val of tares, whose verdures yellowed therever phaeton parks his car, while its tamalized tay is the drame of Drano Filius, where the possible was the improbable, and the improbable the inevitable. If the proverbial bishop of our holy and undivided, with this me ken or no me ken zot, is the quiz tune havermashed, had his 2 nails on the head, we are in for a sequentiality of improbable possibles, though possibly nobody, after having grubbed up a lock of cold corn above his subject, probably in Harry's totalies, or the Vival, will go out of his way to applaud him on the unbiased back of his remark for utterly impossible. As are all these events, they are probably as like those which may have taken place as any others which never took person at all are ever likely to be. Ahan! About that original hen. Midwinter, frur or cur, was in the offing, and premver a promise of April, when Kissachababreeze sang life's old Sahat song, an ice-clad shiverer, merest of bantlings, observed a cold fowl behaviorizing strangely on that fatal midden, or chip factory, or comical-bottomed copse jute, dump for short, afterwards changed into the orangery, when in the course of deeper demolition, unexpectedly, one bushman's holiday, its lemon threw up a few spontaneous fragments of orange peel, the last remains of an outdoor meal by some unknown sunseeker or place-hider illico way back in his mist-ridden past. What child of a strand looper but keepy little Kevin, in the despondful surrounding of such sneezing cold, would ever have trooved up on a straight that was called street a motive for future sanctity, by euchering the finding of the Ardagh chalice, by another highly innocent and beach-walker, whilst trying with pious clamour to wheedle tipperor, raw, re-raw putitors out of now Sealand, in spite of the patch-purple of the massacre. A duel to die today. God damn and big God, sticks and stanks of most of the Jacobites. The bird in the case was Belinda of the Dorans, a more than quinquagenarian, Tertzi's prize with Cerny medal, cheaper Lizzie's Hain exposition. And what she was scratching at the hour of clocking 12 looked for all this zogzag world like a goodish-sized sheet of letter paper originating by tranship from Boston, Mass, of the last of the first to dear, whom it proceeded to mention Maggie well and Owlett Holmes' health, well, only the hate turned the mild on the Van Houtens, and the general elections with a lovely face of some born gentleman with a beautiful present of wedding cakes for dear thank you Christy, and with grand fun funeral of poor Father Michael, don't forget unto life's and muggy, well, how are you, Maggie, and hope soon to hear well, and must now close it with fondest to the tuins, with 4 cross kisses for Holy Paul, Holy Corner, Holy Poly, Holy Island, P.S. from Locust may eat all, but this sign shall they never. Affectionate large-looking touch of titch. The stain, and that a tea stain, the overcautiousness of the master bilker here, as usual, signing the page away, marked it off on the spout of the moment as a genuine relic of ancient Irish pleasant pottery of that Lydia-like languishing class known as Hurry Me O'er the Hazy. Why then how? Well, almost any photoist worth his chemicots will tip anyone asking him the teaser that if a negative of a horse happens to melt enough while drying, well, what you do get is, well, a positively grotesquely distorted macro mass of all sorts of horse-happy values and masses of milk-wise horse. Tip. Well, this freely is what must have occurred to our missive. There's a sod of a turb for you. Please wisp off the grasp. Unfilth from the butcher by the sagacity of look me little like me long hen. Heated resident in the heart of the orange-flavoured mud mound had partly obliterated the negative to start with, causing some features palpably nearer your pecker to be swollen up most grossly, while the farther back we manage to wiggle, the more we need the loan of a lens to see as much as the hen saw. Tip. You is feeling like you is lost in the bush, boy. You says it is a puling sample jungle of woods. You most shouts out, bethicket me for a stump of a beach if I have a paltriest notions of what the fairest he all means. Gee up, girlie. The quad gospelers may own the targum, but any of the Zingari Shurelim may pick a peck of kindlings yet from the sack of old Hensign. Lead, hindly fowl. They always did, ask the ages. What bird has done yesterday, man may do next year, be it fly, be it molt, be it hatch, be it agreement in the nest. For her socio-scientific sense is sound as a bell, sir, her volucrine auto-mutativeness bright as on normalcy. She knows, she just feels she was kind of born to lay and love eggs, trust her to propagate the species, and hush her fluff ball safe through din and danger. Lastly, but mostly, in her genetic field, it is all game and no gammon. She is ladylike in everything she does and plays the gentleman's part every time. Let us auspice it. Yes, before all this has time to end, the golden age must return with its vengeance. Man will become dirigible. Ague will be rejuvenated. Woman with her ridiculous white burden will reach by one step sublime incubation. The main wanting human lioness with her dishorned discipular man-ram will lie down together, publicly flank upon fleece. No, assuredly, they are not justified, those gloom pourers who grouse that letters have never been quite their old selves again since that weird weekday in bleak Genevieve, yet how palmy date, in a waste's oasis, when to the shock of both, Biddy Doran looked ad literature. And she may be a mere Marcella, this midget majesty, mistress of arts, but it is not a hear or say of some anonymous letter signed Toga Girless, teasy dear. We have a cop of her fist right against our nosy boss. We note the paper with her jotty young watermark, Notre Dame du Bon Marché, and she has a heart of Aaron. What loomy lilts as she folds with her foul minears and her Nadia nods. As a strow will show, she does the wind blade, recting to show the rudesse of a rober curling and shewing the fancies of a frisette. But how many of her readers realize that she is not out to dizzle-dazzle with a great uncouth remont of post-Mantuan glossaries from the Lapins and the Griggs, nuttings on her wild life, Graber Gooden Grandy for all old aluminium etymologists like Daria Morius and Zovtry Mazarov Merazimurian Dzman. She feel plain plate one flat fact thing, and if last ways first wise, a man alone sign Anion's uterus has no rates to done a kick at with Anion Anakars about tutus milking fours and the rears on the outer round askisin, the tutus for the forarder. Thing crookling extin every postures ix dicks liken him around hurst the magger by can with down mind looking ated. Mesdames, Marmouselles, Messers, Silver Pace, all Schwantz, Schreitz, ish tell the cock's truth about him. Cap-poop. No Minzy's matter. He had to see life foully, the pluck and the smut, Schweitz. There were 3 men in him, Schweitz. Dancings, Schreitz, was his only 2 feebles, with apple harlots and a little molvogels, specially, Schweitz, when they peaches, honey wore camellia paints, yours very truthful. Add dapple in. Yet is it but an old story, the tale of a tree-stone with one Isolde, of a Mons helped by tent pegs, and his pal what halloosed on the run, what Cadman could but Badman wouldn't, what any Genoa man against any Venus, and why Kate takes charge of the waxworks. That is all the time we have for Wake. For the rest of this week's reading, join myself, TJ, and Neil next week for insight, analysis, and plenty of fun. I've been Toby Malone, joined by TJ Young and Neil Wechsler. I'm excited to have you along with us. We will make up for our lack of analysis this week and the next one, I promise. See you then, meaning seekers. This has been Wake, a cold reading of James Joyce's Finnegans Wake, just to hear it out loud. If you've made it this far, thank you for your dedication. Join us next week for another segment of Finnegans Wake and a chat about what we've found. Wake is a Moon Street Media podcast, engineered by TJ Young and Toby Malone. Our theme song is The Ballad of Perso Riley, arranged and performed by Meg Logue after James Joyce. Wake is recorded in Canada, where Finnegans Wake is in the public domain. For community and bonus content, join us at our free Patreon at patreon.com/wakepod. If you have questions about Finnegans Wake, don't ask us. We're just as confused as you are. See you next week.